Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and evening, depending on where you are calling in from. We are super excited to host this evening's panel discussion on advocacy and human rights. We have a really great group of panelists who will introduce themselves in a second, but we really appreciate that you submitted some questions in advance, and we're going to make sure that we touch base on all of those, but also feel free to drop any questions in the chat as the discussion unfolds, and we'll try to make some time to answer those by the end of the session. Just to introduce myself, I'm Lauren Marcel. I'm a rising MS4 at the University of Washington, and I'm one of the members of the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Subcommittee for PHR. I'll turn it over to Sneha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're super excited for this panel and to hear all of our panelists speak. I'm Sneha. I'm also a rising MS4 at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. And I will pass it on to Victoria.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, just had the landline ring for the first time in years, so I had to turn that off. But my name is Victoria, and I'm a third year at the University of Buffalo.
And we can go ahead and have our panelists start introducing themselves. So we can start with Dr. Boyd.
Hi there. My name is Wes Boyd. I am a psychiatrist currently at the VA hospital in Houston and on faculty in psychiatry and medical ethics at Baylor College of Medicine. I'll say more about my background that got me here during the talk, presumably. Thank you for having me.
And my name is Rich Kovar. I'm a family physician in a federally qualified health center in Seattle. I do full spectrum family medicine, and I've been at this whole thing since the 1980s. So I'm happy to share a historical perspective as well.
Oh, Shafali, I'll start then before you.
Okay, I can go. I'm so sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm Shafali. I'm a medical student, a fourth year medical student at NYU. I was also co-director of the student advisory board this year. And next year I'll be at Georgetown doing ophthalmology residency, and I'll pass it off to Sebastian.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sebastian. I'm a rising fourth year at the CUNY School of Medicine in New York, and I'm the incoming co-director for the next academic year.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us. So we're just going to get started with our first question, and this can be answered by all panelists, anyone who has a response to this. So the first question is, how did you first get involved in advocacy, and how have you incorporated human rights advocacy into your professional identity? And then in what ways can I be useful as a student who lacks expertise or experience in this space?
Go ahead, Wes.
So how did I get started in advocacy? I really never saw myself as an advocate coming out of graduate school, medical school. So I did graduate work in philosophy and a PhD in religion, and also went to medical school. It was really only when I started residency training at a large public safety net hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts, back in the 90s, when I saw the ways that insurance companies made it really difficult for me to give the care that I wanted to my patients. And so seeing the obstacles that they were putting in the way of me providing care for the purposes of making money, that I think was really the root for me in any kind of advocacy work. And so I've actually done a lot of work over the years looking at the ways that insurance companies make it difficult to provide mental health care in particular, and single out mental psychiatric patients for scrutiny and for profiteering. At my hospital, it was a large public safety net hospital with lots and lots of immigrants and uninsured people as patients. And it was about a decade later that I sort of fell into doing asylum work. And that really was spawned because I had a student with me for the year who said she wanted to start doing asylum work. I didn't know anything about it. And so we just got our hands on an evaluation for a template for how to write up evaluations, contacted PHR, and then I sort of taught myself really over the years And a few years later, we started an asylum clinic at my hospital with an internal medicine doc, myself as a psychiatrist, and a psychologist who led our victims of violence program, so specialized in trauma. And it was once we started that clinic that it really became, this work in asylum in particular, really became a large part of my professional identity. I can say more, but I'll stop there.
And I've had interesting that you chose to say that you never really saw yourself as an advocate. There was a time when we didn't recognize that we were doing advocacy work. Is really the other way of, it's gotten much more explicit. But I've spent my entire career in the safety net, and it's been pretty broad. I've worked on 5 Native American reservations. I've worked in several farm worker clinics in this country. But it was really my post-residency experience that informed my career. After I finished my residency in Oregon, I was gone for several years, and in his memory, I was on the Paul Farmer track. We were contemporary, and I made a different decision to come back to the U.S. and work. But I spent several years in war zones and famines, and I was a hunger groupie. And I say that because the stories and the imagery and the trauma that goes with that really informed everything I've done since. The lives, the stories, I've always had that perspective of a real hard look on the world. And I think somehow it's important to get that, to stay involved and maintain the passion for this work. It makes you above all else grateful for the good fortune that I've had, and the ability to constantly over the course of a career feel like you're giving back. I've had experiences on the legal side. I was involved early on in lawsuits suing Department of Health and Human Services around immigrants and access to health insurance in our region. So I've seen that end of it. I've worked through the organized medicine piece a little bit through county and state medical society and resolution processes, which can seem like it goes on forever and inefficient, but it's important. It's important to figure out how to work within the organization of our specialty. And the asylum work, literally, like Wes, I fell into that. It's a very distinct story. We don't have time for it, but it was 1998, so 24 years ago, when there was 0 in the Northwest doing this. And it fell on my shoulders, and I don't know, some 500 evaluations or more later, I'm still doing and teaching and feel very passionate about this important work. But I will say, in case I forget to say it, some of the comments I would make are very, very foundational, because it's a big jump to talk about asylum work. And now there's a Society of Asylum Medicine. But in my experience, there's so much foundational learning and work that rising students need to do about really understanding the intricacies of the immigration experience. So it's not blurring the immigrant, the refugee, the asylum seeker, because they all bring with them hugely immense suffering and challenges that are unique to the different groups.
If I could add something, in hearing Dr. Kovar speak, it really, for me, I think the thing that really drives my advocacy is seeing the pain and suffering of people who come into my office generally as a psychiatrist, and in particular, those who are seeking asylum. The stories I hear and have heard in my everyday practice as a psychiatrist generally are pretty sad and frequently pretty painful. The stories I have heard from asylum seekers, not 100% of the time, but very, very, very frequently, are the usual stories I hear to the 2nd or 3rd degree. So the suffering is dramatic, the threat of death is real, and what drives my advocacy is trying to do whatever I can to prevent this person from being forced to go back to a situation where they're in all likelihood, at a minimum, going to be tortured or harmed, and quite frequently be killed. And so even though I'm uncomfortable, for example, going into courts, I don't like to testify, I will do it in a heartbeat in asylum cases because the stakes are so high. So you want to know what drives me? It's the pain and suffering and the threat of death that people face if they are deported, generally speaking, in these asylum situations.
I actually couldn't agree possibly more with that. It's just that was very eloquently put, but this is by far the most life and death work that I do because the stakes are just so high. In terms of being optimistic about it, it actually does make me feel pretty good about my country a lot of times at a time where we can feel very, very disillusioned. You know, I think of that Statue of Liberty thing, and I think of again, more than out of 500 or more people I've evaluated, I'm aware of 4 people that were denied asylum, and 2 of them may have been granted on appeal. They were moved to other parts of the country. That's extraordinary because maybe 99% I'm convinced would have died if forcibly returned to their lands. And this country gives them a shot at freedom and a decent life. So that's something we should all be optimistic and proud of at a time where it's really, really challenging to keep that optimism up, given everything going on. And I would say that if there's, other than it being life and death, I would say that, you know, there's 80 million refugees in the world and something like 4 million asylum seekers. And what I have learned is if you've seen one refugee or asylum seeker and you heard their story, you've seen one refugee or asylum seeker. Everyone is a unique individual. And there's something about our minds that Wes could explain better. It's safer and easier to start lumping, so it's less terrifying, but everyone has these unique stories, unique hopes, dreams, passions, possibility of success, and also horrors and trauma. And and you have to balance that because, you know, hopefully we'll get to the subject of secondary trauma for us, which is very, very real. And you got it, and every one of you will have to find that fine line and find your way down that tightrope.
Shefali and Sebastian, do you have anything to add from kind of the student perspective? You both have obviously been so inspired by advocacy at this kind of early stage of your careers, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
So it was wonderful hearing Dr. Kovar and Dr. Boyd talk from a very much senior attending level. And, you know, we're kind of just starting our careers, entering residency. I got interested in advocacy in college. I was an international studies major, and I did a lot of community work in Ann Arbor, actually working with refugees and asylum seekers through English as a second language program and kind of refugee resettlement centers. And that's kind of really informed how in medical school, like kind of my interest in human rights and in advocacy and kind of staying involved. And I think what inspired me, I think, in college and even in medical school to be in advocacy, it's still developing. And I think that that's one thing to keep in mind is that as we continue to have more clinical experiences and experiences in the medical field, I'm sure my motivations will develop even more. But it kind of just started as a moral imperative, especially in college, knowing, you know, I have so much, I come from an immigrant family, but I have so much to be grateful for. And I always felt this drive to help others and, you know, give back. And that's kind of where it started as a seedling, and we'll see kind of where it goes as my career develops.
Yeah, I definitely would echo a lot of what Shefali was talking about. I think as students, sometimes we find ourselves like a little bit of a loss because we care about a lot of different issues that are, you know, sometimes it's just not accessible for us to really do something about all of them. And so we have to find a way to just come to a point where we're doing something, but we're really just training ourselves for the future to reach that point where Dr. Boyd and Dr. Kovar are, where they can really feel like they have an impact on these patients' lives and in their communities. So when I got involved in advocacy, it was, you know, really at the undergraduate level at our undergraduate PHR chapter. We kind of, you know, sat down one day and brainstormed, like, what is it that we can do as a PHR chapter at a college that can actually make a difference in our community, right? And that's kind of what I would implore a lot of students to do. It's like, think about at the local level. I mean, there's so many national and international issues that we can work towards solving. But look at your community, you know, in your inner cities or your rural communities. What can you do that can make people's lives better? And sometimes figuring that out will involve just talking to the people that live there, or talking to your school administration or faculty that are doing community-based research. And so we did that, and we identified a problem. It was the opioid epidemic in Harlem, where our campus is based. And so we said, you know what, we're going to make this our issue, our PHR chapter's issue. So for about 1.5 years, 2 years, we just focused on that. And we held a series of opioid overdose prevention trainings, and we had an opioid student summit that somehow got like 100 people to come on a Friday evening to learn about it. And so to the second part of this question, where the student asked, you know, as a student with no experience, like, what can I do? I'd say the number one thing that you can do is actually just raise awareness, like make sure that all of your classmates and everyone that you know is aware of the issue that you're trying to address, the issue that you care about. Because we're med students, we're extremely busy, and a lot of us don't have the time to even learn about these issues. So as soon as you raise awareness, you garner more support, and advocacy is powerful in numbers. And so if you're able to do that, then you've basically just started the process of doing something more impactful about that issue.
Thank you both so much. And thank you, Dr. Boyd and Dr. Kovar, for sharing your wealth of experience. That was very great to hear. Our next question from the students is kind of directed to Dr. Kovar and Dr. Boyd. What are some ways that you advocate for your patients outside of the hospital?
Dr. Kovar, I went first last time.
Well, I think I'm going to have to give you, there's been so many. I've been at this a long time, and there've been so many examples. But I do have to say how this comes down to, in medicine, some of you will migrate towards policy, and you may be in government, et cetera. But at the end of the day, most of us are going to have that opportunity of closing a door with one person and trying to help that person, and being creative as possible to try and come up with solutions. And that is at every bit advocacy as anything on the larger government or regulatory scale. So I feel like, I don't know, I've probably seen 200,000 patients over a course of a career. And I feel like for so many of them, it's been I've figured out a way to advocate for them. I think it's important to recognize that there's no simple answer or definition for what advocacy is. If I were to just kind of make your head spin, if we're talking about this issue of, say, even just asylum, to talk about how complicated this is, and these are all things that I've touched on a little bit, but bear with me, because you're going to have to decide what you're passionate about. You got to pick your passion and recognize, do you have some personal experience? If you don't, how are you going to get it? And are you aware of like what agency, a governing body would be responsible for making a change or bending the curve for that thing? I talked a little bit before about the differences in refugee and asylum and other immigration forms of protection, but you got to recognize that the policies are extremely complicated, and you're going to have to decide how far to dig in. And I would argue this should have been a first-year curriculum issue of policies regarding adjudication, because then it comes into these are going to be your patients that you're going to have to advocate for, and you're not going to be a lawyer, but you're going to have to know, you're going to have your spider sense tingle when a good lawyer or a public defender is going to be needed, whether it's access to a T visa, a trafficking visa, a U visa, a domestic violence visa, Violence Against the Women Act kind of visas, the other Convention Against Torture and other forms of withholding that might allow people to stay in the country. But you also have to recognize, as I think about it, I've worked with policies at different level, but it's often a big abstract thing that's federal. You got to try and meet with your elected representatives' aid to educate them about something you're passionate about, all the way down to the other end of local or state kinds of things. you have to think about, are you interested in enforcement? And if you're interested in enforcement, which I have been, is it within US, inside the US, and how people are being unjustly targeted and profiled, picked up by ICE? Or is it border enforcement with, you know, do you want to get involved in Title 42 that's about to expire? And we're probably going to see about 18,000 people a day rushing the border when that Trump era policy expires. These are complicated. Is it migrant children? Are you interested in healthcare in the detention centers? Is it like we see in our student clinic? Is it genital cutting that inspires you to try and make a difference, either locally, helping that one individual who's suffering, or do you want to try to bend the curve around the world? So there's just so many things. One of the things that came up this last year was writing letters for COVID release based on people's risk of progression of disease and I ended up stumbling into that, writing dozens of letters for people who were detained or imprisoned in Rikers Island. Not something I would have predicted, but you're going to fall into these things. And I'm sorry to go on, but I want to stress the breadth of kinds of projects you may get involved in. And again, the one way to, my two lessons from this, if you remember two things. One is you've seen one asylum seeker, you've seen one asylum seeker, and really the other is whatever you plan, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans.
I like that last part, and I'll say that, you know, I can narrate the course of my life from my undergraduate philosophy days, master's degree in philosophy, and the route I've taken now. I can narrate it now as if it were like a single trajectory that makes sense. But at each step along the way, I was like looking around, like, what am I doing next? You know, I'm stopping this master's degree. Oh, I always wanted to be a psychiatrist. I better start doing pre-med stuff. And oh, I met these two professors in religion who do psychology of religion and anthropology of religion. They look great, you know, so I end up getting a PhD with them. In terms of what I've done outside of the hospital, first of all, I completely agree with Dr. Kovar that seeing patients is advocacy work. And I don't know how you can sit across from someone who has all of these social and economic and you name it factors that are impacting the fact that they're sitting across from you and they're suffering and not feel compelled to move and act in ways that you can do however you can to help them. So I think, you know, being present for patients and doing what you can is advocacy. I've done a lot of other kinds of things outside of the clinic setting as well. And I go back to what Sebastian said about data and letting people, you know, the first step is really making them aware of what's happening in some ways. And so, you know, until people see things for themselves, they don't even realize that this might be an issue that they might want to advocate for. So I sort of stumbled into residency under two doctors, Steffi Wohlhandler and David Himmelstein, who founded Physicians for National Health Program. They're prolific researchers, advocates. They were doing advocacy work before it was called advocacy, and lots of research into health disparities also. And with them, I learned a way of doing research-based advocacy. I mean, that really is their formula. You know, you do a bit of research that might be able to move the needle on a public issue in some way or other. You get it published in a peer-reviewed journal. As it's coming out, you either, you know, issue press releases to try to get it read and seen by more people, or these days it really is writing blog posts to time them to come out at the same time papers do, because you probably know academic papers on average, I'm being slightly facetious, but not very, academic papers are read by exactly 3 people on average: the author who wrote the paper, the reviewer at the journal, and the editor at the journal, and that's it. And I fortunately have never been in a position where I needed to publish in order to keep my job. And so I've always been able to write things because I actually felt that they were important. And if I'm taking the time to do some research, for example, looking into the ways, as I said earlier, that insurance companies really single out my patients, mental health patients, for scrutiny and profiteering, I've done a ton of writing there. I've written a lot about conditions inside prisons, solitary confinement. Certainly everything's been ramped up and amped up since COVID hit, because In most prisons, there is no social distancing. There isn't PPE. There's completely unsanitary quite frequently. So try to promote awareness and just get people thinking about those kinds of issues. And then even around asylum, you know, given the political rhetoric, lots of people across the country think that asking for asylum and asylum seekers are breaking the law, when in fact, you know, asking for asylum is fully legal according to both US and international law. And it's enshrined as a human right in many of those kinds of documents. So for me, outside of the clinic, I've done a lot of teaching, both informal, less formal like this, and also in formal teaching settings. I've done a lot of writing in academic literature and also blog posts, and have served as an expert witness in a number of instances, generally pro bono, including a fellow who's been in New York State prison system for 25 years now. He was convicted at age 17 of second-degree murder when I'm completely convinced it was self-defense. He found me. I've been working with him as a pro bono expert for a number of years, and been into prisons and looked at conditions regarding solitary confinement. So there are lots and lots of ways in which, with your training, you can get involved and try to move the needle in some way or other.
Thank you both so much. The next question is open for anyone to reply. The question is, what was the biggest obstacle on your advocacy journey, and how did you overcome or attempt to overcome it?
My chair, the chairperson in my hospital currently is the first chair I've ever had who is fully supportive of what I do. And of course, the irony is I'm now in a VA hospital, and a lot of what I have done in the past doesn't directly impact veterans, but she's been fully supportive. From the first chair I had after leaving residency, have been questioned more times than I can tell you. And it started with writing about insurance companies. And I was writing op-eds in the paper in Western Massachusetts, and my department chair called me in and he's like, "Why are you writing this stuff?" And I said, because it's all true, and they're really, you know, hurting our patients, doing everything they can to keep us from providing the care we want. He goes, "I know that, but why are you writing this?" You know, he said, "I have to negotiate with insurance companies and have contracts with them, and you're making it difficult for me." And some other chairs have not been quite so explicit, but again, it's been 25 years, and there was one chair I had for about 4 years. He was an interim chair who was partly neutral. The others have been uniformly opposed. And for a while in Boston, I know this because anyway, for a while, I was blackballed from obtaining other work. I actually was looking to get I had a part-time gig at Children's Hospital in Boston in their adolescent substance abuse program, 12 or 15 hours a week. That position got consolidated into a full-time position that I didn't want. And so I went looking literally for part-time work, and I was verbally offered jobs at 3 places: Mass General, McLean Hospital, and the Boston VA, after day-long interviews. And then something happened after being offered these jobs. This was over like a 3-month period, say. The job offers dried up. And one of my references who had been consulted, he said, "Oh yeah, they loved you. They're going to hire you." He said, "You're obviously being blackballed." And I never figured out exactly what it was, but the large speculation, it was one of my department chairs. So you can pay a price. It's a price I'd pay happily. I don't care. I will do this work because it is right and it is important, and lives are on the line, as you've heard. But it can come at a price.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
A little bit from the student perspective, and one of the things that I hear all the time from medical students, and we just finished talking over 60 medical students from around the country that were interested in joining the SAB, and I've heard this over and over again. It's how how do we, and I touched on this before, how do I engage medical students? Like, how do I get people interested in what we're doing? And that includes like, how do I get people to come to events? You know, how do I raise that awareness? Because that's, again, I think that's the start to every advocacy-based initiative. It's raising awareness. And one of the things that what I'll say is, and what we've done in our local chapter in the past, is we thought big about the people that we wanted to invite to work with us and to come and speak at our events. Because you'd be shocked, you know, as medical students, how many people would be so thrilled to come and speak with you and lend their lend their expertise and guidance and just tell their story. And so just never be afraid to really reach out to anyone to come talk to your students or participate in your events. You know, we've reached out to speakers that have done TED Talks with like 1 million views, and they've actually come to our school and talked to our students for free. And I remember when we were planning the 2020 conference, you know, we emailed like Obama and we emailed the Surgeon General, and and of course, you know, you have to be used to a lot of rejections. But when you do that and one person says yes, they will make a huge impact in terms of raising awareness. So I'd say, you know, really don't be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to reach out to people for research or for events, anything.
I can't second that enough about not fearing rejection. You know, I expected anytime I submit an academic piece to a peer-reviewed journal or non-peer reviewed, you just expect rejection, and what you said is perfect.
I want to make a comment that I'm not sure I can articulate it well. It's been some time since I've said this, but you know, it's such an honor to be talking with you guys at your stage of education, because if there's one thing I know as an observer looking back, right, that again, I don't mean to come up with my little sayings, but the problem with life is it can only be understood looking back, but it has to be lived going forward. And what I do know is that you guys are at the top of your idealism. And if I were to make a little curve with my arm here, this is what happens as part of growing up, right? We start off up by my elbow and we kind of take this life course. When we, you know, life, you get tempered, your enthusiasm get tempered, you learn things, you realize your idealism was a little bit out of whack at times, but that's a normal thing. And you will find yourselves on that curve, and good for you to have the self-reflection to do it. What you don't want to see, which Wes and I have seen plenty of, is this. And that steep curve, when you start falling off the idealism curve, I wish you all the self-reflection to understand that with knowledge and life experience comes some tempering of that enthusiasm and excitement and idealism, but it's a good thing. And you need to harness that for the better and be able to check yourself, ask for help if you find that curve to ever be steep, because I don't know that, you know, I mean, I pay attention to what the world's saying about how much I should like my job now, and it's stressful, but I still absolutely love being a doctor and can't imagine doing something else. And you're all going to be challenged by this. It's just the way the world is now. It's overload. But keep an eye on that idealism thing, cut yourself slack, find your passion, understand really what Wes said is that this is going to come in fits and starts. You're going to take a circuitous path. You're not even going to, you'll look back at this and go, how did I get here? And it sure wasn't the way I thought it was going to happen. But that's a good thing. It's a great thing.
I can add one more thing. So I agree with everything everyone said so far, but I think another thing too is one thing I've learned in medical school is surround yourself with people who support you and have the similar views to you. They can really provide a lot of support and a lot of inspiration. Really, I think in medical school, the way medical schools have become, you can reach out to, kind of like Sebastian was saying, you can reach out to like literally anyone on the planet through email, or if you have a social media, Twitter, whatever, and you can really develop really strong networks, and you're just as strong as your network is. So if you can start building that in medical school and reaching out and exposing yourself to the different what's going on in the advocacy world, I think that's a great place to start too.
Thank you all so much. In the interest of time, we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. So the next question is, are certain specialties more conducive to advocacy work? And is it a sustainable model to do this work solely, or can one branch out and focus on a certain area of medicine and do this work as needed? So Dr. Boyd and Dr. Kovar, if you want to provide your take on this one.
I don't think the area of medicine you choose affects your ability to do advocacy work in any way, shape, or form. I'm a psychiatrist, as you all know. I'll just say the woman who was foundational as a faculty member for starting the Harvard Med School Asylum Clinic is a pediatric intensive care doctor at Boston Children's Hospital. One of the most prolific advocates for single payer healthcare happens to be an adult intensive care doctor who trained at Mass General, and he's now at the hospital where I was at Cambridge Health Alliance. And the two teachers I just mentioned who founded Physicians for National Health Program are both internal medicine docs. No, and if I had the skills, the surgical skills or anesthesia skills or both, I might be traveling overseas and doing work in those arenas, whatever my specialty might be. So there are all kinds of ways to do advocacy, and I don't think it is specialty dependent at all.
This is my moment for my bully pulpit talk, because you guys are at the stage where you're seeing a lot of specialists, you're hearing about incomes and debt and all that stuff. Please be aware that the difference between your highest and lowest paid specialties here is the difference between, say, being in the 96th percentile and the 98th and 99th percentile. You're all going to do just fine. It is imperative that you follow your heart, your passion, what really you're most interested in medicine. And there is so much room for, I can't imagine a specialty where, whether it's primary care or subspecialty, where you won't find ways to contribute. I will say, if you choose something that's, like 7 years of a deep subspecialty kind of thing, and you don't pay attention to these issues, you may not come back to them. You will need to find ways to stay passionate on the side, kinds of, when you have time, ways to contribute, because a long subspecialty training is a lot of socialization. You may focus elsewhere, but it is so doable to keep your hands in the game, no matter what you go into, and there's so much room for all these specialties.
As Dr. Kovar was speaking, I just was reminded that I grew up poor in rural Florida and went from public schools to Ivy League on full financial aid. And a lot of people would ask me, why are you studying philosophy? You can't, you have a good mind. You could make a lot of money by going into another field. And this is just, that's the field I was drawn to and fell in love with. And it was only because I picked a bad fitting master's degree program that I'm not a philosophy professor right now. So I really emphasize following your passion. And I always just figured, the money part of it, the job part of it, whatever, it would work out. If I was doing what I really cared about and what I was moved to do and loved, then I'm a lucky person. And I feel along those lines, like I got blessed with a certain modicum of brains and certainly some drive. And I have certain tools now as a physician that I can use to help save people's lives. I mean, I've done it plenty in the clinic and in addiction settings because I run an addiction service, but certainly in working with asylum seekers, this is a way where I can give back in a very personal and meaningful way. So, this work is a huge part of my identity, and I couldn't not do it.
And it's very unlikely that this is all you'll do. You'll do many things, and this work is very complementary to whatever area of medicine you choose to enter.
I agree with that.
I think this kind of feeds into our next question as well, which are just kind of what are some ways to incorporate asylum work into residency that you've kind of seen from colleagues or mentees? And Shefali, please weigh in on this as well, because I'm sure this is something that you're thinking about as you enter residency this summer.
I guess I can start. So one, this is even pre-residency, but I know we have been talking a lot today about kind of the different kind of how to raise awareness, educate, how to build your own networks, how to build your own like expertise. And one thing that I did in medical school that I also really do recommend to medical students who are interested is a lot of medical schools now have dual degree programs where you can do a master's degree in medical school, and they can be quite creative. I know a lot of colleagues who've done like masters in public health. I did a master's in public administration and health policy in my year, and it really helped build a foundation for thinking about these issues and like kind of gaining a different set of tools to be able to think about them. And I'm really excited to kind of see in residency how I can use it, especially since I'm moving to DC. That being said, I think, you know, when I was looking at residency programs and doing interviews, a lot of programs, I like made it a point to ask every residency program I interviewed at, like kind of what they do for advocacy, if that's like something that's stressed in their program and kind of what they've done in the past. I mean, it's a completely fair question, especially in ophthalmology. A lot of people don't know this about ophthalmology, but a lot of ophthalmology residencies send their students to Advocacy Day in DC for like the American Academy of Ophthalmology mid-year forum. And you like the residents directly talk to like the congressional candidates from their home states, and you know, talk about issues in ophthalmology and advocacy that they can get involved in. So there's definitely a ton of from what I've seen, there's definitely a ton of opportunities in residency, and it's, I guess, more about kind of doing research and making sure that you're going to programs that emphasize that as well. So yeah.
I completely agree with that. I interviewed many residency candidates at Cambridge Health Alliance before we moved, and they would frequently ask, you know, point blank, do you have advocacy efforts here in this, either the hospital or the department or the residency program? And also they would frequently ask about asylum clinics. In fact, we have a former medical student from Harvard who I worked with doing asylum work up there, is actually coming to Baylor next year as a med peds resident. And in part, her decision was based on the fact that we also have a PHR asylum clinic here. So I just think asking point blank, doing your research and going someplace where hopefully you'll find a home and at least one area where you might be able to get involved in and feel good about the work.
I would be remiss in not staking out a little bit of a bias that I have around this. In the modern era, I see a lot of students and residents that unfortunately are a little long on these social issues, the social aspects of medicine, and a little short on the clinical skills that are required in becoming an expert physician. This is not a popular stance to articulate these days, but your job is to become an excellent physician in the area that you choose. You wouldn't be on this call if the social stuff wasn't going to just follow along. But always keep that in mind. You would never want to get yourself, this is not second fiddle. The areas of scientific expertise do not play second fiddle to this other kind of advocacy work, or we'll call they come hand in hand. But make haste slowly on this and make sure you've got all your T's crossed and become an excellent clinician to be able to do it. Don't let it shortchange, because and it's a real thing. This is real. I'm not just making this up. And I'm that voice in the interview that if somebody's just so passionate that they're going to hit the ground and that's all they're going to really want to do, they still have to pass the 3 a.m. test to save someone's life in the intensive care unit. So just be a little careful about it. But I would point out, also be careful about the asylum work, because recognize you don't want to be set up for frustration. You may well not be in a position where you can do much as a resident. Recognize that a resident cannot be the primary evaluator. It all has to be signed off by an attending. That may or may not work. The case may not even go to its conclusion in the time that you're there in the residency program. And that's kind of hard to wait, but learning about it's important. You're going to really have to have a faculty person that will totally commit to backing you up. And it's hard. Systems aren't made for this, because at the end of the day, the worst thing you can do for an asylum seeker is to allow a government attorney on an otherwise seamless case to attack credibility, like, oh, you're a resident. That's something we need to really, really be super careful about. And from my point of view, we are the foundational work that needs to be done is something I think I said in the introduction, is make sure you fully understand the different types of immigrant experience, the rights, privileges, legal protections that are and challenges, financial, educational, housing, everything, subsidies that have come along with all the diverse groups of people that make their way to this country.
Yeah, I just want to second a couple of things there. First of all, absolutely, you need to be the best clinician you can be. You need to be able to roll up your sleeves and get into clinic and do what you need to do to take care of patients. And also, what Dr. Kovar said about having an attending or knowing you're going to be assisting on cases, but you're not going to be taking the lead as either a medical student or a resident. Because you, as he said, you really do need to have credibility with the courts. You need the first thing that happens when you go into court to testify really is the question about whether or not you're qualified to be an expert. And if the answer to that question is no, everything you've done up to that point counts for nothing. You don't get to go forward and testify. Your report essentially becomes null and void. And so anyway, I'm just seconding what he said.
But that said, there are models where you really team up with an attending, you do it together, and you make that very clear to the courts, and the attending has that expertise. So it's doable, but don't die on that hill. Just learn as much as you can, because the residency will be over in a blink of an eye. You'll go to one of these trainings, and then it will be you with that expertise doing this work.
Oh yeah, when I do evaluations with either medical students or residents or other trainees, we are seating the client together. We talk about the client afterwards for 30 or 45 minutes or whatever it is. Someone else will write the initial draft. I'll put edits. No, it's a collaborative process, top to bottom. And I fully involve trainees who work with me, like in every communication with the legal team, from the earliest to the very end.
Thank you all so much. So I guess we just have about 8 minutes left on the hour. So we'd love to open up any questions from the audience. You can either unmute yourselves or throw a question into the chat, and we'll make sure that we ask it. But we'd love to hear any other questions that are lingering. And thank you all so much again for sharing all these pieces of advice and experiences. It's so inspiring and helpful to hear.
If nobody has a question imminently, I wouldn't mind asking one if that suits you all. I'm actually an attending hospital medicine down in Charleston, South Carolina. And I have recently, with world events, become fairly passionate about asylum care. I'm wondering, from an attending standpoint, how does one who is already an attending kind of get involved? Are there particular organizations that you would recommend that we get training in?
So this is going to really depend on where you go. What's amazing to me here, I'm delighted to be on this panel with a strong representation for Physicians for Human Rights, because really they pioneered a lot of the approach to forensic work whether that's on an individual basis or in a war zone where you have to collect evidence. So it's really important, but recognize though you don't know all the acronyms yet, but whether it's Physicians for Human Rights, the Center for Victims of Torture in the Upper Midwest, the Health Right International based out of New York, the International Rescue Committee, the ACLU. There are many organizations that are involved in this kind of work that you'll be able to connect with. So there's just a lot. There's a lot of opportunity. It'll be unique to the area that you end up settling and doing your next training with.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the most expedient ways to get involved specifically in doing asylum work and performing evaluations of asylum seekers is to go to one of the Physicians for Human Rights trainings. They usually happen on weekends. It's usually a full day, perhaps sometimes longer than a day. But they will teach folks how to do both mental health evaluations and physical evaluations of asylum seekers. And at least in the trainings that I've participated in, will offer, I mean, I certainly have offered this many times, that people who undergo the training who don't feel like they can quite do an evaluation by themselves yet, sit in with me, and we'll do one or two together. I'll read the report before you send it to the lawyers, and be as collaborative as possible in that respect. The other thing about writing up reports for the legal team, and Dr. Kovar may feel otherwise, I always tell folks it's an open book test, because you're going to send in an evaluation and they're going to send it back to you with suggestions for edits and so on. And it's a collaborative process. But in the end, I've never been asked to say anything that I didn't agree with. I've never been asked to fabricate anything or anything like that. So in the end, you're going to generate a report that the legal team is happy with and that you feel good about.
Let me just piggyback on that with one comment, because it reminds me of what was hardest about this work. We spend our entire training in our career being advocates for a patient, but if you do this work, you would be about to change hats, and you're going to be a forensic CSI specialist. That there's nothing about that experience that can the worst thing you could do is smell like an advocate, like you're trying to help this person, like you believe them, like anything else. You're a forensic expert that is I think the best way to put it, if you're an advocate at all, you're an advocate that they get due process under the law, not that they receive a certain protection or an outcome. And that, to me, was a struggle for a while, because you go, but I know this happened, and oh my God. But at the end of the day, it's this flipping of a switch. And I'm sure that Wes knows this very well. You can't get sucked in, because the first person that will suspect that's going to be the judge. Because, and again, I don't know if you know this, but when these people have to apply, they have an administrative hearing. There's no jury. This is just a government attorney, a defense attorney, the former trying to deport, and a judge that makes an administrative decision along guidelines given to them by the Department of Justice. Thus, the problems we've had over the last few years. So it's a really important thing to get your head around. Some people can't do it. They just can't just turn it off, because that, everything else we do is about helping and advocating for an individual. This is a very different animal.
Yeah, and no matter how much I might want someone to be granted asylum, in my report, in my demeanor, and in my testimony, I am really sticking to the facts. Nothing but the facts.
There's a lot of great links in the chat right now, but there's also a link in there from the PHR national website about how to get involved as a clinician evaluator if you're interested.
Thanks a bunch.
Lauren, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Well, first, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining this webinar today and for our amazing panelists for sharing their expertise and insight. I think we all learned a lot and feel more equipped to kind of continue on our paths as advocates and future clinician advocates. I just wanted to take this second as well to make a plug for our final 2 events of the sexual and gender-based violence series. They're both live events, so it'll be great if you can join in person rather than watch the recordings later, because they will really rely on engagement with participants. The first is on identifying sexual and intimate partner violence in the clinical setting. And the second is kind of touches on what Dr. Kovar mentioned, is all around kind of identifying secondary trauma within ourselves as clinicians and kind of developing a toolkit for how we respond when that trauma is identified in ourselves. So we hope that you'll be able to make both of those if you are interested. And thank you so much to everyone for participating tonight. It was a wonderful event.
And I just want to say thank you to Victoria, Laura, and Sneha for actually putting this together and for putting together this amazing lecture series. I would really encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to go and watch those recordings. It's been amazing, and you guys have done incredible work. So thank you.
And likewise, just want to thank Sebastian and Shefali for being our fearless leaders / leaders to be of the SAB. Shefali had to step out a little bit early, but thank you all for being here, and thank you so much, Dr. Boyd and Dr. Kovar, for taking the time and sharing your experience. Really appreciate it.
Really fun. Thank you for having us.
Great.
Yeah.
Honor and a privilege. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Really nice meeting you. Take care, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.